So I'll give you some context on that. So besides running Farrow Partners Architects, as you know, 2 years or so ago, I started a Master of Neuroscience Applied to Architecture degree at the University of Venice as a fly-in student. And so who doesn't love Venice? I mean, the city of water, it's magical on so many ways. But I got to spend a week, a month living in Venice and walking home late at night and taking a little gondola across the Grand Canal to go to school every morning. And it was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, such a brilliant experience, and it sort of changed about halfway through the pandemic. But I was there in November when they had the second highest flood that has ever occurred in Venice. And equally, in the nighttime, when I walked home, what I began to notice that the streets were full of life and lively. But when I looked up at the buildings, they were dark. And so, really, the Archipelago plan is a very practical, and some have described it as a very far-sighted, I'm told, a plan that hasn't been imagined to date, really to address what I began to understand was what I've called the two floods of Venice. And both have had a devastating effect over the last 50 years on the city. And the two floods effectively is water caused by flooding caused by rising sea levels because of global warming. And the second is the flooding of people. That's a wave, a great wave that's coming over the city. But what that has happened is it has resulted in really tattering the social fabric of Venice, and in fact has left it very, very brittle. But then overlaid on top of that is COVID popped its head. And what it did is it brought a very fragile or brittle economy absolutely to its knees, a mono economy to its knees.
So you mentioned a couple of the threats. How has Venice been coping with these threats, and are they well poised for the future, or what are the challenges they've gotten in that sense?
So what I'm going to start first with is the remarkable side of Venice. Like it's magical. It's utterly magical on so many fronts. So think about all the things where we talk about planning a city, that we don't want it car dominated. We don't want it traffic dominated. Here's a place when you're walking around, after a week, I find it extraordinary because I can hear my heart. I can hear myself thinking because there's no cars. And so all you hear is the walking of steps, the splashing of water. It's extraordinary. You think it's rated as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It's renowned for its architecture, its artwork. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's the place of some of the most extraordinary Renaissance things. But arguably, it's a failed city. And what's a failed city? Well, a perfect example is Detroit. In the USA, that was gutted because of sort of a mono economy as well as some other things. And so what is a failed city? What is it's called? Well, one is it has massive depopulation. So the city in the 1600s had 200,000 people. Lots of people were coming and living there, all kinds of different backgrounds. By 1960s, it shrank to 175,000 people, and that's where it was really stable. But right now, it has shrunk to 55,000 people. And so if you think about that, that's a 70% decline in its population from when it was booming. Like, that's staggering. Back to no lights on, in the buildings up above. And overlaid on that the young people aren't staying there. It's a thriving city for great universities. But once you get your degree, you go somewhere else because you don't think you have job opportunity and lifestyle opportunities. You then look at, so that's, the removal of people. You then look at the flooding of mass tourism. So if it's got 55,000 people there permanently, every day, on average, 60,000 people come to the city, 60,000, more than the actual population. And most of those are day tourists. So they're not coming in spending money. They want to come in, take their snapshots, and they leave. Part of the problem is also the shops are now bought by foreign people. So the bakery, the hardware, all of those things that are the fabric of daily life, they've been turned over to trinket shops. And you notice it on the main, everything in every shop is virtually the same until you get to some of the really unique, meaningful neighborhoods that are there. Then you pair over it the flooding of water. A third of the ground floors aren't habitable because of water damage. 2018 saw 121 days of high tides, which is 80 centimeters above sea level. And so what happens is the buildings then become susceptible. You can't borrow money from banks because of the flood risk. And at the water levels that the city was designed, all buildings had a stone portion that's where the water was when they were originally built. Now that water is permanently higher, it's getting into the band where the brick is. Salt water gets into brick, it dries out, and when it dries out, it crystallizes and explodes the brick. So suddenly you've got, a permanent cycle, and in 20 years' time, effectively, 1/3 of actually all of Venice not only will be damaged, well, it'll effectively be underwater. So what has the government done? They put in this called the Moses multi-million-dollar surge barrier that comes up. So if there's a storm surge, not just the regular high water, there's a storm surge, it stops that extra water coming along. They've tried it once, and in fact, it's worked, but it doesn't get to the roots, the permanent roots of water that's too high up. The affordability matrix, everybody's moved out and put their flats on Airbnb, so it's very expensive to live. It's effectively an overpriced theme park. Imports versus exports, it doesn't produce anything anymore. It used to have a factory that produced pasta. Then they're importing olive oil, they're importing pasta, they're importing all the trinkets, everything that is Italian. No longer, it's coming from China, like the olive oil is coming from China. It's got to a stage where it's crazy. And then there's a financial meltdown in 2006, and then COVID comes along, and it's a perfect storm because suddenly from the economy, everything that the mono economy is tied to is suddenly stops dead, and there's nothing else. Now it's lovely to live there because it's empty, assuming you have an economic safety, and the water becomes clear. But suddenly you've got a perfect storm, which is ecological, economic, and societal, the city getting clobbered.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's tragic. I mean, it's
really
it's extraordinary because this place is going to crumble and fall into the sea without question, because it's impossible, at least in the path they're going, to stop what's happening.
Yeah, it really is tragic, and such a beautiful city with a rich history. And I was reading the document you sent over in preparation. I didn't know how interesting the whole history was. But one of the things in the document also was this concept of Antifragile, which is a book that me and you both, like we were speaking about before this podcast. So how does this concept of Antifragile tie into as a design philosophy going forward?
So Nicholas Tavel, as you well know, and we've shared some chats on that, we're both quite fond of. His book Black Swan is amazing because, in fact, the pandemic is in fact a perfect black swan. A black swan is something that doesn't exist and suddenly exists, and it upends everything. And the book talks about, too big to fail, and Lehman Brothers failing, and of course the economy can't fail, and then suddenly it does. And in fact, as we got into the pandemic and we were wrestling with a variety of things with helping our clients navigate our way through it, suddenly his book, Antifragile, came front and center. So what is the basis of the theory? And the way he describes it, I think, is fantastic, where he says, okay, take a candle and take a bonfire, and then take a terribly strong wind. What happens? Well, the candle is very brittle and it goes out instantly. The bonfire, it's the exact opposite. Bring on the wind and it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And then the other example, which is really the opposite, well, is or similar, is that, well, look at you go to the gym every day, and the more you ride on the treadmill or you run or you lift weights, what happens is your muscles get stronger and stronger and stronger because of the force that's applied to it. If you're sick and you lay in a hospital bed, what happens? Well, suddenly your muscles and everything just begins to fade away. But the exercising, the force, makes it very strong. And so all of the discussion we've been having on COVID, and we have to make sure that our healthcare system doesn't crumble. We have to insulate our cities. We have to bring back our economies. So that there's lots of discussion that we have to be careful that they're not brittle. Well, what's an economy look like that's anti-fragile? What's a society look like that's anti-fragile? The whole thing of the imports and how fragile our market economy has been, that's laid it clear. Canada isn't producing its own vaccines, which means it's very fragile to the supply chain, and that's why we're having a hard time on where we are. So if we turn our mind to a society, a building, an economy, a city like Venice, what would you need to do to make it anti-fragile? And that was really part of the thing of the study, because the Moses flood storm surge barrier, it's very brittle, and it has been, because if it doesn't stop. But it's also single-use infrastructure. It only does one thing, and it doesn't do anything else it's asked, which is back to the discussion we've had earlier on values and value and values with an S, that does more. One is about sort of the monetization of something. Single use, yes, it checks that box off. But what happens if we did a flood barrier that lowered the water permanently, that created jobs, that created a place that Venetians in the dense city could go and have an allotment garden, that could go to exercise, could go open their mind. And it created jobs, it created places that university students, wow, if they were studying in agriculture or other things, they could go and practice agri-tech, high-tech, great Italian industries that exist on food production. What happens if it could produce food and change the economy and have food security and actually export things like the Netherlands does? The Netherlands is the second largest food producer, but it's arguably one of the smallest. The first largest food producer in the world is the United States. The United States is like this, and the Netherlands is probably like about that. So why couldn't Venice do all of this as opposed to a single-use thing? And so that's where the whole idea of the anti-fragile just accelerated the thinking on the design of really what this plan was all about.
That's so fantastic. So it's the stress placed onto the city, rather than just building a wall and maintaining a fragile city, actually using that stress to evolve it in a new way that actually improves the city rather than makes it worse. So it's a great philosophy.
Well, and what's happened is, and now we're beginning to be very tightly involved in one of the leading NGOs in Venice. And what the problem has been is, in psychology terms, it's called a problem trance. And what it means is that you're fixed within a box, and you can only see solving the problem within this. but you have to create more space. You have to open it up. Because what are the solutions they're looking at? Well, we need to find a way to get tourists to stay longer. We need to get richer tourists that will stay longer and spend more money. We need to limit the amount of cruise ships, but they're all still within the box. But why can't we imagine a new economy? Why can't we imagine adding more islands to Venice? I mean, Venice was defensive. It was a bunch of fishing huts that people escaped the German Huns coming to rape and pillage, in the medieval evil time. So Venice has always grown and grown and grown in islands. When it became a UNESCO site, arguably it got a glass dome set over top of it and nothing could change. Then with the change of tourism, that flights were cheap, everybody said, okay, we got to go to Venice, we have to go to Machu Picchu, we have to go all these places, and arguably it's decimated something that was very, very special. So now we need to reimagine. And in fact, what I found is the idea of the Archipelago project. Suddenly, people said, we'd never thought that, well, can we create some space, which is effectively, the idea is creating a necklace, an archipelago necklace.
Fantastic. And as an architect, you're very renowned for the incorporating human health into your design. So how are you going to incorporate human health at the heart of all of this?
So health and wellness and health and well-being are kicked around a lot these days. And arguably, I think well-being, the being of being healthy, is because we felt very fragile. So I define health, if you think of a building, the roof is, that keeps you dry, is sort of optimal health. But the roof is held up by 4 walls, arguably. And one wall, in defining what supports health, one is ecological health. Design clearly has a significant impact on it. The second wall is physical health. So car-dominated suburbs has risen effectively to a rise in chronic disease. The third wall then is around societal health. And so arguably we've seen that COVID has, in a big way, brought to light all of the inequities in societal health and the way we design and keep people here. Certainly the whole EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, Black Lives Matters, segregating people by design is very real. And then the fourth one is really mind health. How does space make us feel, and how does it make us feel better? Or in fact, the opposite, that I feel scared on walking home at night. And so our plan for Venice really has 4 primary elements to it. And one is this archipelago, this necklace of new and existing islands, like a necklace that has a number of beads. And the beads are effectively the islands that are all connected together, which create both a water and a cruise ship barrier. And so by creating that necklace, the water within gets reduced down to prehistoric level, back to that zone of where the stone is. So that suddenly the buildings can now be resilient again, because the stone isn't porous. But equally important, Venice is very much connected to the lagoon that's around it. And so between all of these islands, between the new islands as well as the new and the existing ones, there are locks. So they're porous. So think of Amsterdam. So the water and boats still have the ability to come back and forth through it, but the water levels are different on one side to the other. So the porousness is important because it has to be connected to the larger lagoon as it has been. The second idea is creating this decentral park. So this whole thing that we're creating is a new 32-kilometer necklace of active and passive green spaces, and effectively the largest new park in Europe. And the decentral park, because it's not like a central park in that has urban wrapped around it. In fact, it's the opposite, that the central park is really the central city and the park wraps around it. So if you're Venetians, you have the ability to leave. It's like going out into the countryside. And what are you leaving to? Well, the park events are both rocky hiking hills, there's sandy seashores to walk on, there's boardwalks and swimming areas, there's community plazas. So it's both active and passive, but there's also allotment gardens. So you, who live in a very dense area in Venice, you can go out and you can cultivate your own flowers, you can cultivate your own vegetables. But the third piece of the puzzle of the design is creating these pavilions in the park. So if you think of the Crystal Palace, for example, in London, way back when, that was in the middle of Hyde Park, it showed all of the great technologies of its time. This is doing the opposite because it's highlighting Italian agri-tech, high-tech food production. So what is that? That is hydroponics, which is the growing of little microgreens. It's also starting the seeds that then can be used in glass houses, for example, like the Netherlands, which has a brilliant glass house economy and culture, and in fact, very integrated to university and research. And so there's a great tradition of that in Italy. And so the idea is these pavilions, like the Crystal Palace, should show food production. And so we all know about, vertical food productions and all of that, is let's use those both as employment, as in high tech, as in tying to the university, as a new stream of jobs on the one side, and aiming towards food security, but also exporting, as has happened in the past. But all of that lovely food then on boats, like you see in the canals in Venice, which was amazing, as you see a boat there, and it's your vegetable store. Like, it's amazing, and it exists. So can you imagine this being produced and then that all coming back into Venice? So as you walk home, you pick up your food. It's absolutely fresh, tomatoes and peppers and everything would be part of it. And then the last part is the moods of the park. They've been orientated so that each segment, tied in the north segment, the east, the south, and the west, all have a different feel. And we've tied the feel of the design to those spaces to Vivaldi's music and, his famous concerto, the Four Seasons. And so the one that looks towards the mountains, the famed mountains in the north, that they're gorgeous. When I first went there, I said, what are these mountains? And they're snow-capped. And so we've said, well, let's have that park to be more rocky and have grottos that you hike across. But underneath the pavilions are grottos, and therefore they have the mood of winter, but the pavilions are sort of arched, and that's where the microgreens and the hydroponics are. Spring is very different, and in fact, there's islands and there is some farming there, but those pavilions are all then about apiculture, which is bees and honey production. There's the famous flowers that are grown in that region, which I've got a blank on, but there are these beautiful hanging flowers. But then there's also the walking along the seashores, but you would then go to allotment gardens for flowers and other things, but there would be beaches and such. The summer is different because summer is all Vivaldi's music is about optimism and the big storms, the summer storms that come pounding in. And so we've tied these to big boardwalks. We've tied the parks to, which they have, that you pull boats up and you watch a concert or you watch a film. And we've also have aquaculture, which is about sustainable fish farming and sustainable shell farming, but also about places to go and swim that you see in a variety of different cities. And then the last one is really fall, and the theme of that is glass houses. So fall is, as we know, about all the bounty coming off the land, and allotment gardens, so you can grow your own stuff in market squares and gardens where you can see all these beautiful, tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and things that use very little water, effectively no pesticides, and you get the bounties coming off that can then be exported. So the idea is that you could create a new park, 32 kilometers. You could have, along with the great marathons, running marathons in Berlin, London, Paris, and Rome, Venice could have its own, and you could start in Old Venice. You could go out and run through the winter landscape, the spring landscape, the summer, the fall, and then end it in, say, St. Marco's Square. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing? But you're going there about health. And as you go past, you would see the most sophisticated food production. You would see people creating their own food. And if you're a Venetian, you could leave just to go for a walk, not just the beautiful blue spaces, but all the green spaces. And so the idea is that you take a thing that's a single use infrastructure. Okay, we have to stop water flooding. Okay, what do? Let's put up a barrier. That cost about 20 billion euros to do it. This thing would effectively be in the same thing of just the dredging, and very simple, but it creates the societal health, which is really the important part, is health, not just value, monetary, but values of bringing back all of the extraordinary opportunities in the history of Venice, which made it great. Vivaldi went there from somewhere else. Everywhere went from somewhere else. And interestingly enough, the idea of quarantine started in Venice because the ships had to be quarantined for, I think it was 40 days or something. So it all comes back to the beginning of pandemics and reimagining what Venice might be going forward, trying to take that problem trance and create effectively wider space around Venice, which is the new archipelago.
That sounds absolutely magnificent, and I can't wait to see this vision one day be executed, because it's absolutely phenomenal. And will you be incorporating timber as part of this strategy to improving health in the Archipelago project?
Well, the amazing thing is all of the pavilions are built in wood and timber. And why is that? Well, interestingly for me, is the history of Venice. We look at all of these fantastic stone buildings, these palaces, but the only reason that Venice is there is because they pounded, tree trunks into the soil, and the more tree trunks you pounded in together, it suddenly created the stability of the soil because they're close together. But wood, the amazing thing is, instead of brick, when salt goes into that, it crystallizes and explodes. The salt goes into wood and creates effectively the timber as stone. And all of the piles that are there have lasted for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. That's the one side. On the other side, the boat building tradition in Venice is all about wood, which is extraordinary. And so we thought there's certainly boat builders that are still there. And in fact, a number of them that create the lovely boats that you jump into. So that tradition of building, we said, let's take the same tradition and put it into the architecture, because it's craft and you're showing that, but it is beginning to show what the brilliant culture of building was there. And in fact, the other one we're bringing in, like the glass houses, is the Monero glass, which is part of the history. So it's trying to pull the past into the future to be able to express the roots of the city itself.
Absolutely. And what are the next steps in this development and making this vision into reality?
Well, the document that we created, what we said very specifically is what we've done is to try and imagine a different scenario. We've worked it up in tremendous detail, and it's achievable from an economic, social, or whatever. But then we said at the end of the report, hold on, all we've done is to create something that you could imagine in a great way of a different scenario, and we want to float it out, and we want to start discussions specifically about it. You could build this plan, but on the other hand, it could be a starting point that goes somewhere very, very different. And so interestingly, as I mentioned, one of Venice's leading NGOs that's trying to imagine a future, I sent it to them, and the director came back immediately and said, this is amazing, we need to talk. What are the next steps? What can we do together? I said, we just have to start having a discussion of imagining a different future. You will know the people more than anybody. We did do studies, we engaged with the university and a variety of other things. So we have our first session with them in about 2 weeks' time, which we're excited about. Other major external bodies, so those are internal bodies. External ones, for example, like the World Monument Fund, they've had a long relationship with Venice, and they've been quite intrigued by it because it allows, in fact, the water to be brought back to historic levels, which then stabilizes the city. If you stabilize the city, then you can begin to work incrementally. And in fact, then banks will begin to loan against the buildings because you don't have continuous ongoing risk. So I'm very excited about it. So why am I? Because I was there and I saw something that was really heart-wrenching, that I figured that I don't have grandchildren, I have kids, but when my grandchildren, when eventually they come around, I don't think they will be going to Venice because it'll be a ghost town. And I can't imagine that. And I can't imagine a city that's 55,000 people and it has 55,000 coming every day, dropping garbage. The pollution is extraordinary, and it's not real. But this place was an extraordinary model of what all of us would love to be there. And I was, just intoxicated by, only a week flying in and out, but at least you could begin to really imagine what an extraordinary place, and to be able to do it every month was amazing. And that's why we developed the plan. And now, interestingly, it's beginning to get legs. And I think it might feel, maybe you and I, when we're older and a little more frail, will be on the seniors program of the new Venice marathon. So, but we better stay healthy and ensure that what we do causes and creates health in everything we do. So,
absolutely. Well, I've really loved hearing about this project, and I sincerely really hope this dream comes true, because it's absolutely amazing. And if people want to find out more about this, where should they be going? And I can put any links into the show notes, so those listening now, they can click and go.
If they go to our website, Farrow Partners, all one word, so partners with an S.ca, they can go on there and you'll see a link right off the top. But it's a discussion. So I'm anxious for people, if they ideas, observations, thoughts, comments. We're very much about co-creation in everything we do. So the more people around the table, the better the outcomes.
Well, thank you so much, Tye, for your time. I really enjoyed that conversation. And it's been a real pleasure chatting to you and learning about this project.